So I'd like to welcome Jack Benjamin, who's a reporter at The Media Leader, and Simi Lindgren from CTO and founder of Yuty to the stage. Please put your hands together.
Hi everyone, how are we doing? Very good. Simi, for anyone in the room that doesn't know you or doesn't know what you guys are doing at Yuty, why don't we start by just giving the quick, minute long, what is it actually that you guys are looking to build?
The elevator pitch.
Yeah, exactly.
Hi, I'm Simi Lindgren, founder and CEO of Yuty, and we're transforming the way that brands connect with their consumers, leveraging hyper-personalisation, code word for AI, but we try not to use the word AI at all, but that's what we're doing. We're connecting brands and consumers in this time where they're incredibly disconnected. Beauty consumers are called disloyal, and customer acquisition costs are going through the roof. That's what we do.
Alessandro just spoke about how people want more personalized experiences, but they are sometimes afraid of sharing that data with companies or brands. I'm curious, one, is that true for what you're seeing? Are consumers a bit scared of sharing that data? And what are those sort of stumbling blocks?
So I think what we know from the beauty industry specifically is that 76% of beauty consumers actually are dying for personalization. And I don't think, there's stats to support it that say, but I don't think since personalization was the word of the year back in 2018 that it has been done incredibly well yet. But contrary to what Alessandro said, I think Accenture actually did a study where 83% of consumers said they were willing to share their data. Should they get these personalized experiences? I think there is just this issue around the transparency of how their data is being used, which could be better communicated, how and whether the recommendations or the level of personalization is actually relevant. Whether you're receiving Amazon, Netflix recommendations, or whether it's hyper-personalized, I think that's where the issue has been.
Can you talk a little bit about what's different from the Amazon type of model? I mean, I think everyone's familiar with getting recommended products by searching or buying other products, but what are you guys doing that's differently and hyper-personalized?
Yeah, by the way, there's nothing wrong with the way Amazon does do personalization, because obviously they're amazing. But Amazon leverages and Netflix and YouTube leverages collaborative filtering, which is okay if you're wanting to understand similar audiences and the way they behave and their preferences, and then make recommendations that way. Where we're not exactly content-based filtering in terms of the way we make recommendations, and there's kind of 2 or 3 different ways that you can do this when building recommender systems. But just for the purpose of ease, we'll say that we're content-based, that we require inputs to be able to make recommendations, which means that they're incredibly relevant to the consumer or the user at the end. And there are benefits to doing content-based versus collaborative, right? There isn't a requirement for big data. And I think when we think about how data is sourced and synthesized, there can be huge amounts, millions of data points that is required from consumers and you're not particularly communicating how you're using that data. And then, with content-based filtering, it's incredibly easy to use. The consumer's receiving these incredibly relevant, recommendations, and you're somewhat solving that kind of cold start problem, again, back to the data, but you're able to be more transparent about how the data is being used. So, that's what we're doing at Yuty. Yeah.
In terms of, you mentioned transparency, the privacy aspect, specific to Yuty, what are your models based on? You mentioned AI, although we don't need to talk about the big buzzword, but how exactly does it work, and could it work for outside of the beauty world as well?
Yeah, so I think when we're building and deploying any kind of AI models, obviously, it requires data, right? And when we were thinking of Yuty back in 2016, I wasn't able to use the available databases that were out there, such as NVIDIA's FFHQ. I wanted to understand, what is fine lines and wrinkles, or hyperpigmentation, or acne, or were all of these particular beauty concerns, what does that look like on a range of people? And the available data sets that were out there, just one use case is that, I wanted 1,000 images of 40-year-old women that were phototype 1. Phototype 1 is generally Caucasian. And what I saw was that, 40-year-old women in this data set looked masculine. And if I trained the model on that, essentially I'm telling the model that if I wanted, if we're going to make recommendations, or if you're going to recognize someone, and they're 40 years old and they're phototype 1, and they're female, actually they look more masculine. And we didn't want that kind of bias, or to kind of embed that bias into the model. But so we went out and generated data. So we leveraged generative AI, not the GPT, but the GAN side. And we create about 1,000 synthetic images every 108 minutes. And that's where we're not using your face. That's where we're not using customer data to actually train our models. And so we can be transparent in the fact that even though we are joint controllers of the data initially when we're making the recommendations, that we're not going to use it after 30 seconds after that recommendation's made to you, and you can delete your data. So that's really.
And that's communicated directly to whoever, whatever consumer is using it.
Exactly.
You mentioned in a previous conversation that we had that consumers feel brands don't know who they are and they want them to.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that disconnect in terms of, they want more personalized experiences, they want brands to understand who they are as people, while also managing, okay, we have a huge data set of data that we've created to try and guess as close to possible who they are. Mm-hmm. Where does a survey come into play? Where do you ask people directly, what do you want, versus tell them what you think they want?
Yeah, I think historically, we as builders or entrepreneurs or whatever have been so in love with, I guess, the solution, as opposed to really going straight for what is the problem. So we essentially need to fall in love with the problem. How do you fall in love with the problem? Is by interviewing and speaking to the person or the people you're trying to solve that problem for. So it's really important that we're taking their feedback in order to be able to build something that they want, as opposed to tell them, because I'm in love with the solution, this is what you should have as well. And I think that's where the disconnect specifically in the beauty industry has been, because consumers have felt like, okay, so when I hit X age, I need anti-aging, or if I'm a teenage, I need acne products. And that's not the case. Acne could potentially hit you at any stage of life. And the same for when you need, products that have retinols in it. Actually, most probably should be using that in your everyday skincare routine, potentially. Mm-hmm. So it's just really understanding who that consumer is and fixing that disconnect. How do we fix that? How do we get to understand, and should we be making recommendations or driving personalization based on a similar user's profile? Is that relevant? Is that targeted enough to drive what brands want to see? Which is, ultimately, if you're leveraging or want to use personalization, you want to increase revenue, right? You want to gain some insights. You want to reduce churn potentially, and ultimately you want to offer the end consumer an elevated experience. And if you're doing that by thinking they're like that person as opposed to seeing them as an individual that they are, there is no one size fits all when it comes to, beauty and also in personalization. For someone to feel and want to spend more and to get that increased average order values and reduce that CAC, you need to get to know them.
Can you speak a little bit more to how personalization is really driving better business outcomes? You mentioned sort of deeper engagement. What about greater lifetime in terms of coming back to brands that have offered you a bit of a more personalized experience?
I mean, we have a use case with one of the brands that we work with where we're not involved in the acquisition, actually driving traffic to their site, but once they're on the site, we're able to engage that consumer in a very specific way, which is by us educating them on the products that would work for them after they've taken a selfie and gone through the questionnaire. Now, with that specific brand, they were able to see 70% of the traffic like actually convert, which was incredible. They had their average order values increase from, I think it was around 16 to 68 pounds, and they saw increased retention. Now that was exciting for us because at the beginning, before we received any VC backing and backing from Google, it was actually, this is the thesis that we have, that if we're actually providing people with not collaborative filtering type of recommendations, but supremely personalized based on them and their individual inputs, and then providing something, providing those outputs, they would spend. They would come back again, they would feel incredibly, connected to the brands, they would be loyal. That was a thesis that we had, and to have that proved out on so many of the brands that are customers of Yuty was super exciting for us.
So beauty is an area where I think it makes a lot of sense where people want that personalized experience, but there's lots of brands probably in this room and outside. Banking is one example, but if let's say you're trying to buy a Hoover or something like that, you still might want that personalized experience, but how do those brands go about? What would you recommend, I suppose, how those brands would go about incorporating more personalization, more personalized experience into products that might not be immediately obvious, like, oh, this person has a certain complexion?
Yeah, so I think, all businesses can benefit from personalization, as I mentioned earlier on. It's just good business to understand who your customers are and surface the right content or products that would ultimately drive revenues. And the other aspect of that is the insights, right? So you're getting to know who your customers are, and then you're able to reel them back in, maybe spend less. So I would say it's really defining what the objective is. What is it that we're going to be using here? Are we going to be using just collaborative filtering, or is it, we're going to go content-based, or is it a hybrid recommender system? And then, test that. I think testing is incredibly valuable, testing that with your customer base, really trying to see whether that solution works and iterating. But also communicating, I guess, that the transparency around how that customer's data is going to be used is incredibly valuable, only for them to feel like they can trust you to continue testing and surfacing further recommendations for them. There's a whole gamut, but personalization should be at the forefront, I think, of most businesses and brands' minds.
We've got about 2 minutes left. I want to make sure we have the opportunity to, if anyone in the audience has a question that they'd like to ask, just raise your hand. That's okay. I've always got more questions. So you mentioned earlier that your AI models based on sort of created face data that you've made that hopefully reduces bias in the model. I'm curious how you view artificial intelligence versus, let's say, I think a word you mentioned in a previous conversation was augmented intelligence.
So when we talk about AI, at Yuty, we talk about augmented intelligence. So we think that it's incredibly important to have humans in the loop. And we are obviously working with regulators and trying to drive legislation that speaks to that, because without humans in the loop, we won't be able to drive creativity or innovation or all of those other aspects. But AI is I don't know, let's think of a huge LVMH, and then the sub brands like Louis Vuitton or Moet Hennessy, that's AI, ML, DL, those various different aspects. And I think, us being able to use generative AI specifically to create fake data, to be able to reduce biases and ensure that we're driving that diversity and balance in data sets is incredibly important for us. But on the other side, being able to just use everyday AI, machine learning, and have that human input so that we can, create better recommendations is really, really cool for us. And being able to train those models and deploy those models with experts, because AI isn't experts, like told what to do, and is able to make like a prediction. And it's lots of statistics and analysis that it does based on the amount of data we fed it. But it can't like have those wonderful moments we've talked about. Oh, we've got like no seconds left. But I talked about with like Estee Lauder, Le Labo, how do we bottle nostalgia? Like it's incredibly hard to do that. Like AI can't do that. But yeah, that's that.
Still need the human element.
Exact 100.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that is all the time that we have. But everyone, please give a big round of applause to Simi.
Thank you.